hello there, everybody. I'm Michael Tomasky. I'm the editor of the New Republic magazine, and we have a terrific conversation coming up with three great guests talking about the future of the Republican Party. I want to introduce our guests one by one. Jennifer Rubin is a writer, columnist for the Washington Post, a very prolific Washington Post columnist, by the way. It seems like every time I turn around, there's a new Jennifer Rubin piece up there on the site. She's also a contributor to MSNBC. Stuart Stevens, longtime Republican political consultant, been involved in so many campaigns, most notably probably George W. Bush and Mitt Romney's campaign. And he is also the author very recently of, get this title, It Was All a Lie, How the Republican Party Became Donald Trump. Very pleased to have Stuart as well. And finally, Alyssa Farah Griffin is co-host of ABC's The View. She's a CNN political commentator and former White House comms director under Donald Trump, former press secretary to Mike Pence, also a spokeswoman at the Department of Defense, adjunct professor now at Georgetown University. Welcome to all of you, and so grateful to you for taking the time to join us here today. So this conversation is a continuation of a conversation that started in the pages of the May issue of the New Republic, where I moderated a roundtable of four also brilliant and thoughtful people, Nicole Wallace, Michael Steele, Juliana Glover, and Max Boot. And we talked in that conversation, which you can find at TNR.com, about is there any hope for the Republican Party? We thought we'd follow up that conversation with this live one. So let's start in, and I'll start with you, Jennifer. And my first question is a very simple one. Just you read that roundtable. What stood out to you? What was your reaction to it?
Well, I think there were two things. One was Nicole Wallace's quip that you could fit all of the Never Trumpers into a minivan at this point. And I think it's really sort of more severe than that. I think those of us who kind of woke up when Donald Trump arrived on the scene, it was clear that the administration and the party was going to be a Donald Trump administration, Donald Trump party. That for all intents and purposes, I stopped being a Republican. So I am a never Trump, never Trumpism, never Republican, at least now. So I'm not sure that there are even a minivan worth of people who are still Republicans, who remain Republicans, who are there to rescue the party, fight back. Michael Steele says that he is still there, and I adore Michael. I think he's doing it in part to, as he said, annoy the right people. But those of us who left because we saw the Republican Party was a threat to democracy, and it really had now exhibited no restraint whatsoever. That all of the bad things that the left had said about Republicans for years turned out to be true, and in very disturbing ways. And so who is left? And so this notion that the Republican Party cannot be saved, I guess the question is by whom, by what? It is what it is. And the Civil War, the fight for the soul of the Republican Party, that's done. That's over. And the good guys lost. And so I think really the question is what comes now, or how long is this Republican Party going to last? I think the other thing that kind of struck me about the piece was sort of the degree to which all of us are now quite candid about what became of the Republican Party, and quite candid that there were certainly signs and trends that began well before Donald Trump. And I don't think there is really sort of a major political shift in which there are so many prominent public figures who, in essence, have kind of woken up. The only thing I can analogize it to is when the Soviet Union joined the Nazi-Soviet pact, and suddenly a lot of people on the left said, wait a second, this is not what we signed up for. So I think it's in some ways a historical oddity. It's unique. But I now spend my days not thinking how to save the Republican Party, but how to save the Republic. And that seems to be an ongoing problem, frankly.
All the isms are now wasms, the man said at the Hitler-Stalin Pact. It's sort of true here too. Stuart, what struck you from the roundtable discussion?
Well, I'm not as optimistic as Jennifer. Um, it I, um, I do think there's no party that really is worth saving, though. There are these Republican governors out there. Phil Scott in Vermont, there's Charlie Baker in Massachusetts, Larry Hogan, Maryland. I work for all these guys. I love them, but they're very popular in states that if Republicans could carry, they would run the world. But they're treated with sort of benign neglect at best by the party. The telling thing there is those guys couldn't even pick their own state party chairman, which, if you're involved in politics, a popular governor not being able to pick a state party chairman is just unimaginable. So I think that we're at the beginning of this, not anywhere near the end. I don't think that 22 was a positive year. I think it could have been worse. But at the end of that, Marjorie Taylor Greene is now the second most powerful member of the House of Representatives. The two leading contenders for the Republican nomination for president basically support Putin. I have a pretty simplistic view of this. In a lot of ways, I think we underplay the role of what happened with the Russians being involved in the 2016 campaign. At one level, it's pretty straightforward to say they decided to back Donald Trump. They won, and what did they get? Well, it turns out they got a lot. You have now what was the party that was the most consistent foe of the Soviet Union, Russia, is now the most consistent supporter. To a degree that there's a pro-Putin movement in American politics, which there is, and it's growing, it's in the Republican Party. So you have someone like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who there's always been nuts and weirdos and freaks around certainly the Republican Party I can speak to because I always had to deal with them. All these people like Bannon and Legowski, Kellyanne Conway, it's not that they woke up in 2016 and decided they wanted to be involved in presidential politics. Nobody would let them in. It was just unimaginable that they would be involved in presidential politics. And Trump rounded up sort of the stray dogs and the broken toys and let them in. But it's just amazing now that the party, I think you have to say, has been compromised. And I don't think it doesn't really matter if that's because of some, blackmail stuff, but the party now ideologically is much more aligned with Putin. The vision that Putin has of Russia, there's no gay people, there's no women in power, we're all good Christians. That is very close to what the Republican Party wants to be. So I can't tell you how it's going to end, but I think if Donald Trump is elected, reelected, you could say. I'm comfortable saying it'll be the end of any democracy if we've known it in America.
Okay. On that note, Alyssa, your thoughts on the roundtable discussion?
It was fascinating. I didn't disagree with the assessments of any of the participants about the near-term future of the Republican Party. But when I look at this question, is the GOP savable? What does the future look like? I start from the place of, is that even the right question to be asking? To quote Speaker Pelosi, this country deserves two vibrant political parties. We do not have that right now. When you have a party, my political party, I'm still a registered Republican, that the vast majority of members of it deny election results, deny, the basic principles of our democratic republic, that is not a vibrant political party. But what I would reframe about kind of the question about the future is, I don't know that it's an option to fully give up on it. And I say that because of this. And trust me, I totally see Jennifer's point about the fighting from within sort of argument that some of us have continued to make, because it is a fool's errand in many ways. I wake up every morning and feel like I'm on an island, still being a Republican, hoping that things I say will break through. But my fear is this: Donald Trump got 74 million votes last time around. Donald Trump is very likely to be the Republican nominee. You know, if I'm a betting man, he's going to get the nomination. Unforeseen events could happen that could certainly harm Joe Biden's ability to win the presidency again. We can't exist in a reality where we just deny the potential that Donald Trump could be president again. And so long as that is the clear and imminent threat that we are facing, I do think that people who are willing to engage on the right have to use every faculty that they have to try to warn about why that is so dangerous. So I would love at a later date to have a bigger conversation about, is there a way to come back from this very almost backwards, like Pat Buchanan kind of Republican Party that we've morphed into that's much more of a populist nationalist party than a conservative or even libertarian leaning party. But to me, the most imminent threat is the Donald Trump factor. And to put a finer point on it, I worked for him. I know him personally. I've flown all over the country with him. I've, flown on the helicopter with him. If I am warning you and I am telling you he is dangerous, he is a threat to democracy, he will destroy this republic as we know it, and then to basically hear crickets from elected Republicans not heeding that warning, it's stunning. And it's a gut punch every time I see a new prominent Republican endorse him, who all saw the same thing I saw on January 6th, who also, by the way, saw the same thing, we saw many other things before that. That's just the starkest example. So my primary point being, I think Nicole, Max, Steele's points were spot on, Juliana's as well. But there is this sort of this narrow window that I think anyone of good faith who cares about this country and also our standing in the world has to engage. And they have to be, ringing the alarm bells about the danger of Donald Trump. And if that means engaging with sitting Republicans, I think that's necessary.
Yeah, I definitely want to try to circle back to that if we have time, the question of the behavior of other Republicans. But I want to, since this is called the future of the Republican Party, let's make sure we get it in. So I want to go around to the three of you with this hypothetical. And this, as I've thought about things, is probably the sunniest hypothetical from the perspective of, maybe having a prayer of rebuilding the party as something normal again, that I can conjure up. Trump is the nominee. Joe Biden beats him and beats him handily enough that he can't seriously challenge the results. And the same things happen in the courts, 59 out of 60 cases or whatever. So Biden is sworn in. Trump has lost. The Democrats have recaptured the House. They have somehow miraculously, because of some combination of Trump running a crazy campaign and the way the abortion issue plays out, held the Senate. So it's a clean sweep for the Democrats. Let's add to this that Donald Trump maybe gets convicted of one of these crimes. Okay, at that point, the Republican Party must reassess in some way. What happens with the Republican Party's inner deliberations, Jen, in my scenario?
I'm not sure they reassess in the way we would like them to reassess. Their reassessment, their first instinct will be, well, Donald Trump just hung on too long. He was, the guy who didn't know when to hang up the sneakers and move on. That if we had had a younger guy, if we had had a Ron DeSantis or some other mini Trump, that we would be just fine. So our mistake was hanging on to Trump too long. They will not admit error. They are not going to overthrow the existing mindset, in large part because they are no longer leading a movement. They are following it. They have so radicalized tens of millions of Americans that if they spoke up, if they said the emperor has no clothes, they would soon be primaried, as we've seen again and again. They would be out of office, and we would see a Trump child or someone equally as bad running for office. So I don't think the reassessment comes in one election cycle, maybe two, maybe three, maybe more. But even that is problematic because, as we all understand, there's a bias in our system against clean sweeps. It's very hard now to beat the other side so overwhelmingly. thanks to gerrymandering, thanks to the way we've physically separated ourselves, thanks to the Electoral College. So we're not going to have an election, no matter how well Biden does, that is akin to a Reagan sweep or for that matter, a Nixon sweep in 72. That's just not going to happen. So it's going to devolve into this kind of finger pointing exercise. We really didn't do it right. We didn't have the right combination. And so I think they're going to wallow in this for a while. But I will say, raising the point about abortion is, I think, exactly the right thing. They not only have a crazy problem, they not only have a sort of believability democracy problem, they have, I think, awoken a sleeping giant, which is the not even pro-abortion, a pro-freedom, a modern America that no longer sees the Republican Party as anything that they want to have anything to do with it. The big news of 2022 was that Dobbs prevailed, and it prevailed again in Wisconsin, a state which never is decided by more than a point, was decided by 11 points in this latest state Supreme Court race. So I think they have a problem. And as the generational tide takes us further and further away from the Fox News audience, which is mostly in their 70s right now, this problem is going to increase. And I think for once, Democrats have an issue, a cultural issue, an issue of freedom. I was delighted to see that opening ad from Biden. That's the kind of ad that Stu would have run on a freedom kind of message with many of his candidates in the past. And I think not necessarily going directly at democracy, but going at this kind of tyrannical, really oppressive kind of, I guess fascism is the only way we can really describe it, is really going to be increasingly problematic for Republicans. But it's not going to happen in one cycle. It's going to take a long time.
Stuart, thoughts?
Look, I think that political parties take on personalities like sports teams. And the personality of the Republican Party now is angry, aggrieved. It is mad at the future. And I think that's a very difficult thing to unwind. We've had hate movements before in America, plenty of them. I mean, there's a fascinating question why in the 30s America didn't become fascist. Probably because FDR was president. Had Lindbergh been president or Henry Ford, we probably would have been. But we haven't had a major American party embrace hate as its ethos. And that's what the Republican Party has done. And it's very, very difficult to change this because there's really no desire to change it. You've got a world in which 85% of Trump's coalition is white. And I think there's a good case to be made in somewhat simplistic, but I think accurate terms, that this is all about race. So the country's 60% white, less so since we've been talking. We're headed to a minority-majority country. So right now we have this moment, I think, of grave danger where increasingly the norm is minority rule. I mean, if you look at the Supreme Court, 3 of them are appointed by a president who received a minority of the votes. Arguably, Bush appointed 2 others. As somebody who worked in both Bush campaigns, I think it's fair to say, had Bush not been elected in 2000 with the minority of vote, not winning the popular vote, he wouldn't have been elected in 2004. So you can make a good case that 5 of the Supreme Court judges were appointed by people who are not supported by the majority of the people. So what do you end up with? You end up with Supreme decisions like the Dobbs decision, which are overwhelmingly representing the minority of the will of the country. And so if you look at someone like Ron DeSantis, I think he's much more dangerous than Donald Trump. And it is the willingness to use the power of the state across the board to stay in office and to enforce your will in office. And I don't think that's going to change. I think the best hope might be 2032. Just ask yourself the fundamental question: when will Republicans nominate someone for president who will assert that Joe Biden won a free and fair election in 20. It's unimaginable that'll happen in 24. I can't really imagine it happening in 28. Um, so I can't tell you how it's going to turn out, but I think the greatest danger is not to recognize the greatest danger. And I think this is where American exceptionalism works against us, because we believe we're special and we're not. And there's a reason that conservatives are obsessed with Hungary and Viktor Orban, because that constitutional regression model of how you slide from democracy to autocracy is underway now. We talk about this, January 6th coup, and that if it's not punished, it's just practice. I really think that's true, but it's not the way to look at it. The whole purpose of what is happening now, the intent of what is happening now, is to make the need for a coup unnecessary. So if Georgia passes a law that the state legislature can overturn the popular vote, when they do it, it's going to be perfectly legal. Yeah. And that is what's going on here. There is a construct of a legal justification for a shift to autocracy that I think is ultimately the goal.
Wow. Alyssa?
I'm very depressed.
Yeah.
No. It's a fascinating to hear your takes, too. I've asked myself basically this exact scenario many times, and I wish that I believed in this sort of mythical course correct that's going to come. I'm somebody who loved a Charlie Baker, a Chris Sununu, a moderate governor who knows how to govern both the left and the right, and who's not making their entire brand grievance, anger, and division, and bigotry. Mm-hmm. But having been on the inside of it, I've seen that even when very bad things happen and public sentiment starts to shift against Trumpism, or when he does something that, defies every historic norm, there is still how quickly the party goes back to him and morally and ethically justifies doing so. It's hard for me to see that, losing 2024 would lead to a party that rejects what Trumpism is in the near future. I do think that it's going to take much longer. And I hate to oversimplify. I would point to the 2012 RNC postmortem, which essentially laid out in very stark terms why the GOP was not moving toward being a majoritarian party, why we could absolutely bank on not just losing the Electoral College, but why we have lost the popular vote for more than 20 years. Seeming bigoted on immigration and wanting to bring in the best talent, wanting to be, the shining beacon on a hill that welcomes people into our country, which was once part and core to the Republican identity. Being on the wrong side of LGBTQ issues, understanding that the sentiment of the country has changed so rapidly on this issue, you will lose millennials, Gen Zers, and voters on down if you don't course correct and accept marriage equality is the law of the land. Denying climate change, you will lose an entire generation of voters rather than offering, a conservative alternative to deal with the, pending issue of climate change. We instead have figures who are still continuing to deny it. And then, of course, I think the individual liberty platform, what always attracted me to conservatism was the idea that I can kind of believe whatever I want, but I'm not going to project it on you because I have individual rights and you do as well. To Jennifer's point, abortion is going to be such a hard issue for Republicans to navigate this cycle. I think that will likely be the X factor more so than even Trump on the ticket is. Because when you're at a place where we're going so backward on what was once Republican orthodoxy to even if you were someone who considers themselves pro-life, we've always stood up for exceptions for rape, incest, and life of the mother. Now you have prominent Republicans like Marco Rubio saying, no, we don't even support that. You have states that are not even putting in place basic exceptions. So then you have obviously these examples of women having to, carry to term babies who have died in their wombs, dealing with the trauma of that. You're going to have, I hate to even say it, but God forbid, you're going to have mothers who die from botched abortions in southern states. We cannot claim to be the party of life when that is happening. I run through those quick examples. There are so many more, but simply to say, we have a numbers issue, the Republican Party does, and what their decision has been is rather than actually change the policies to try to bring new voters into the fold, it's to try to rig the system so that we can try to win that way. The younger generation sees through it. I think that's the biggest X factor and why I don't see a course correction coming, even if Donald Trump gets smoked. And just kind of finally, I would say is Trumpism is bigger than Trump. I think even at times he is stunned by how powerful the movement he created is. I come back to this moment. He was doing some right-wing network sit-down interview, and he said something suggesting that he was proud of the vaccine and would encourage people to get vaccinated. And his own base came after him,
He got booed.
calling him out for projecting that sentiment. And it shows that I think he created a monster he doesn't control. And by the way, Ron DeSantis doesn't control it and no one else does. So it was, in part of this, you can't leave race out of this discussion, because I think a factor in Donald Trump's rise was by recruiting and reaching out to the voters that in, Stu's era, the GOP, you weren't targeting them because you frankly didn't want their fucking vote. You didn't want the white nationalist vote. You'd rather try to get, a sane suburban coalition of respectable people. And unfortunately, that became kind of a core part of the GOP's voting demographic, rather than trying to reach these voters that I'm talking about. So I think that's something that we are going to have to reckon with. Actually, one more final thing I want to say on this. You also can't forget the money aspect of this. There is $1 billion plus industry around Donald Trump, MAGAism, Trumpism, of people whose entire livelihood and profession is built around perpetuating him being in power. And I would say this applies as well to like the lesser versions of him. And even if sounder minds in the party come forward or some inspiring leader comes forward, it's hard to break that cycle of people profiting off of the hate and division that he's spent years stoking. So it's a bigger problem than just replacing the king with someone else. There is this entire network and universe of people under him.
Let me press on. I want to press on this. Yeah, go ahead.
Can I reinforce something that Lisa said? So, in the campaigns I worked in, like take the Romney campaign in 2012, the one that prompted the autopsy. We would look at polls and we could see that there were low intensity white voters who were probably not going to vote for Romney, who would vote for a candidate if they went the xenophobic, racist way that Trump went. If you went out and said stuff that he said on Muslims. Now, this was never even discussed, to be honest, because you can imagine what happened if you walked into Mitt Romney's office and go, look, man, we want you to call a Muslim ban. You'd be thrown out of the campaign in a heartbeat. But what I would have thought as a campaign professional, and I would have been wrong, is that whatever you gained at the lower end, you would have lost at the upper end with college-educated Republicans. And no Republican has ever lost college-educated voters. Gold would have won them. And that's what was happening in 2016, right up until the Comey letter. And that proved to be why Biden was able to win, because enough of those voters left. But Trump was able because the party was silent and supported him. They weren't silent, they supported him. He was able to have that coalition.
One of the moments in the earlier roundtable discussion that made me sit up in this chair, I was sitting in this same chair, was when Nicole Wallace said, I knew America was fucked when Rob Portman didn't stand up and say anything. And to her, Portman was an exemplar of a kind of Republican who she fully expected would have opposed Trump and Trumpism and did not. And that was particularly telling to her. I wonder if the three of you have personal moments like that were shocking and dispiriting to you. Jen, can you go first?
Certainly, Paul Ryan, who had been the nominee for vice president under Mitt Romney, who didn't believe in any of this kind of stuff, him kind of at first holding back and then clambering on board. But really the point at which he sealed the nomination, that was Indiana. And at that point, That's when I said, okay, I'm done. This party has accepted this guy. We can no longer say that, he's some kind of, marginal figure in the party. He is the party. And although some of us held out for some kind of Rube Goldberg contraption that would save the party and the country in the convention, that, of course, was not going to happen. And I think it was at that moment really that I saw, the handwriting on the wall. But I would also say, and maybe we'll get to this longer, the one way for sure that Trump gets reelected is if there is a no labels kind of party on the ballot.
Yeah,
this
right.
is an existential threat to the Republic because they have targeted and they are going after weak Biden voters. They say it themselves. If you look at their maps, if you look at their literature.
What do you think these people are up to? What are they up to? No labels.
There's two theories, or maybe there's three. One is that this is a money game. Money is such a racket now in politics that people don't care about the country. To make $1 million or raise $1 million, they will sell this country down the road, in a nanosecond. The other is that Mark Penn is out for revenge. The party doesn't like him. They throw him out essentially, and he's out to show them that he is much smarter than everybody else. And I guess there's a third option, which doesn't apply to the people running it, but certainly the donors, which is they're just kind of misbegotten. And I have called on smarter billionaires to have an intervention with these billionaires and to say billionaires do not let billionaires give to no labels. So I think that is a serious, serious threat. And unless it's nipped in the bud, unless people are, properly convinced that this is nothing but an aid to Donald Trump, it's going to get awfully dicey.
Yeah. Incidentally, the New Republic wrote the story last week that a $100,000 donor to New Labels in the last cycle was none other than a man we all know now, Mr. Harlan Crow. But I want to continue on this personal line of questioning. So, like Alyssa, so you stayed with it longer, obviously, because you worked in the administration. But what was your breakaway moment?
Yeah, my journey is certainly different than Jennifer and Stuart's. Yeah. For me, this is late, but it's scarring in my mind is Rick Scott going down to Mar-a-Lago after January 6th. Just to me, and again, this speaks to probably my own naivete in dealing with Trumpism, is there were so many things that were beyond the pale. And some of them, by the way, happened while I was there. I very much, hope that I used my voice as much as I could internally when I was there to push back on them. But I don't know that I've seen something in my lifetime domestically take place like January 6th. And one thing I want to say, because what I get pushed back on from the right is, nobody technically lost their life that day. Some officers were injured. It was a riot. It was a protest. Not even necessarily true, but the significance of January 6th, of course, is the physical attack of the Capitol. But the much bigger significance was the fact that this was an effort to disenfranchise 81 million voters and to try to overthrow the entire democratic process because one tiny man could not admit that he lost the presidency. And that so many elected officials, all of whom knew better, decided to try to back up this essentially coup attempt. I say all that, I just truly did not think that he would be revived again after January 6th. And I still find myself like kind of stunned that it's like, oh yeah, people are lining up to support him. He's outperforming all the other candidates. Nikki Haley won't take a shot at him, but here we are. That will be scarred in my mind. And McCarthy went down and kissed the ring as well. So I'd say those two instances.
Yeah. Stuart, what was your moment of disillusion?
Look, Michael, this is this is really even hard for me to talk about because I helped elect Republican governors and senators in over half the country, and a lot of these people, some were just clients, but a lot of them I became friends with. So it's such a personal betrayal to me that it's really difficult for me to talk about it, to be honest, without getting emotional, because I
Yeah.
just never thought it would happen. And look, I wrote a book about this, and the first line is "blame me," because there's kind of a trope of books in Washington that people write like, if only they'd listened to me. I couldn't
Yeah.
write that book, but they did listen to me.
Yeah.
And I don't know why I didn't see this. I mean, I know that there was a group of us that believed, that sort of saw this darkness, and really, if you thought of it genetically, that there were sort of two strands, and there was a dark strand, and then there was those of us who were drawn to compassion and conservatism, and we thought we were the dominant gene. And I don't know any conclusion to come to, but we were completely wrong, and we were the regressive gene.
Yeah.
And if you go back to this autopsy, it was presented not just as a political necessity, but as a moral mandate. That if you're going to earn the right to govern this big, cacophonous, confusing, contradictory, brilliant, growing, bizarre country, you need to be more like it. Yeah. And that is a privilege you have to earn. And the essence of democracy is being willing to lose and being willing to admit that you're wrong and to value the other's opinions, that maybe there's something here that I'm wrong about. Mm-hmm. And then when Trump came along, all of that was just thrown aside, and you could just hear it with this audible sigh of relief that we don't have to pretend we care about this stuff and we can just win with white voters. And when I went out and spoke against Trump in 2016, it's probably an exaggeration to say a third of the party, at the top, reached out to me and thanked me. Mm-hmm. But I was doing, on election night, I was doing this thing on PBS all night. And about 10 o'clock, I started getting emails and texts from people asking if maybe I could erase those emails, get rid of those texts.
Oh, wow.
And I just saw it happen. And I just never would have thought it was possible. But I know we say we can't talk about Germany but I think we have to. And I'll never wonder again how 1930 Germany happened.
Yeah, absolutely. Stu has been so honest and forthright about this, but I think we've all had the experience to say, were we the suckers? We actually believed in this stuff. We actually believed in free trade. We believed in the free market. We believed in U.S. leadership in the world. And these other people were just faking it, apparently. And so I think it's a combination of feeling like we were complete naive rubes to be taken that these people actually had principles, because so many of the things that I once believed in, I still believe in. But I think the notion that there was this smaller segment of the party that always lost, Pat Buchanan always lost, but we could vote for people that we were proud of. We could vote for John McCain. We could vote for Mitt Romney, who were principled, decent people. And I didn't agree with everything they had to say. I always had a problem with the party on abortion, for example, but they were decent, honorable pro-Americans. And to kind of see just the sheer careerism, the sheer hypocrisy, I still haven't gotten over it. And, this band of us who kind of left, including the people who were in your roundtable, we could look around at each other like, gosh, we were rubes, weren't we? It's this combination of feeling like, we were the only people in the room who understood that this was all a fraud. And secondly, that we so grossly underestimated the underlying bigotry, xenophobia that has been part of the Republican Party, frankly, since 1964. And you see the through line, through obviously Goldwater and into Nixon, the Southern Strategy. And so we've been loath to acknowledge that it was there in such a form that it was destined at some point to break out. And the analogy to, I think, fascist regimes is absolutely correct. When you look at the use of violence, when you look at the otherism that creates a atmosphere of fear, when you look at the vilification and nullification of other aspects of loyalty, professional loyalty, loyalty to a military code of ethics, to a legal code of ethics, to a medical code of ethics. All of these factors, you can go and tick the box. We're not in 1933, we're about 1931. And we're at the stage where a lot of people, including too many in the business community, are willing to make a deal with the devil. And a lot of people voted for him the second time because they wanted those tax cuts. There's nothing more important than those tax cuts. So here we are.
We've got about 15 minutes to go, and I'm sure everybody who's watching us would like all of you to handicap the 2024 election. So let's proceed to that, and let's start with the Republican primary. And I'll start. What is it? I'd like each of you to give me a percentage chance that Trump is not the nominee. I would say that is probably 10 to 15%. The one thing that I think on my naively optimistic days is that if Chris Christie can winnow it down to a one-on-one race, maybe there's a slim chance, because Christie will attack him. And not I don't think quite half of Republicans are MAGA Republicans. So maybe there are people looking for an alternative. But I think Trump is almost certainly the nominee. Alyssa?
I'd probably put mine pretty close to what you said about, I'd say 75 to 85% chance that Trump is the Republican nominee. The only major factor that I think would change that, I think, by the way, an indicted Donald Trump, or once again indicted Donald Trump, I think that actually makes him more likely to be the nominee. When I see people like, Marco Rubio coming out and defending him after his indictment, I think that's significant and shows where the party is. The only way I see an alternative breaking through is an unforeseen candidate getting into the race. There's the Chris Christie talk. I do worry, and I generally like Chris Christie, but I worry about some of the vulnerabilities he has in his closeness to Trump. I think it makes him an imperfect messenger. I've hyped Chris Sununu earlier, but if there's somebody who could step in and show a closer version of what I think we all bought into as Republicans, which is, it's something closer to compassionate conservatism, something that's inclusive, that's not driven by grievance and bigotry. But if you're Chris Sununu, why do it now? Why not wait it out for the mythical course correction that's coming, or wait till Donald Trump's too old to run next cycle? A friend of mine who I've been nudging and saying, if nobody's going to hit Trump, Will Hurd, former congressman representing San Antonio, spent a long time in the CIA, was seen as one of the most bipartisan members. I'd love to see someone like him get in for no other reason than to get on a debate stage and challenge Trump, because that's my biggest fear, is no one's even going to hit him. I think you're going to see the 5%ers nipping at each other's heels, going after each other and just, kind of promoting Trump to the nomination. So very likely the nominee, but praying for a dark horse.
Stuart?
Well, look, brother, I did all the Chris Christie's races. I love Chris Christie. It breaks my heart that Chris Christie didn't stay Chris Christie.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to come out here and say negative things about him, because I love the guy. And I've seen him on a personal level be extraordinarily kind and generous and gracious when there was nothing in it for him. But I think it's a tragedy that plays out. I don't really think the question is Trump. I think it's Trumpism. So I go back to the leading candidates for the Republican nomination support the Putin position in this war. And normally this doesn't matter much when you have crazy people like Marjorie Taylor Greene. But Marjorie Taylor Greene could win the war for Russia. We should not underestimate, because if a Republican is elected, if DeSantis or Trump is elected, and there's not a decisive win by Ukraine at that point, Russia will win this war. So we will have enabled genocide. So it's just so lost And there's no desire to change in the Republican Party. That's what we have to understand. They are what they want to be. At every opportunity, they had a chance to stop Trump, and they didn't. And they continue to do that. So there is free will here. There people can vote. They're not being forced to do this. Will Hurt could have voted to impeach. He didn't. Chris Christie didn't have to work for Trump's debate prep in the second, but he did. So I have zero optimism about it, except that look, I spent 30 years of my life pointing out flaws in the Democratic Party, okay? And I can come around and support the Democratic Party. And I would have voted for Bernie Sanders if he was a nominee, even though I spent half my life Bernie Sanders driving me batshit. I live in Vermont for a time. But you have to vote for Democratic candidates. You have to do that because there's only one party in America that still believes in democracy. And the rest of this stuff, I go back and like Joe Trippy's involved in the Lincoln Project. The ads that we used to make in campaigns against each other, like, are we going to lower the capital gains tax to 28% instead of 35%? Are you kidding me? We used to argue about this stuff. I mean, it's like arguing about your cholesterol count in a knife fight. It's so trivial. So there's a straight up, not for some of us, not most pleasant choice. You have to vote for Democrats if you're going to save the country. It's the only path.
Jen, any chance Trump's not the nominee?
I guess he could have a major health crisis, although his family lives forever. He'll be indicted, but he won't be convicted because there's not time enough for that. I see no scenario under which, as things stand now, that DeSantis is going to be able to knock him out. The only scenario I see is I go back to 1968. It wasn't Eugene McCarthy who became the nominee. He was just the guy who roughed up LBJ and got him out of the race. And then there was a battle, and if RFK hadn't been assassinated, he would have been the nominee. So it doesn't necessarily have to be the same person who knocks Trump out that is the nominee. You could imagine Chris Christie somehow beating him over the head and somebody else coming in. But I think we're mistaken if we think that Donald Trump is going to get on a debate stage. There's no way he's going to do that. He's going to say he's above it. It's all rigged. He doesn't have to. So that's not happening. I think as much as, Liz Cheney said she'll do anything to keep Trump from being president, the one thing she could do would be to endorse Joe Biden and to say, despite all these differences, he's a good and decent man. He knows Russia must be defeated. And by the way, Marjorie Taylor Greene has already prolonged this war because Putin has every incentive now to hang on and hang on. He just has to wait this out, and he has the hope of Donald Trump returning and his merry band in Congress. So they've already contributed to the carnage and the atrocities there.
Yeah. And now let's all handicap the general election. Alyssa, can you go first?
I imagine, I think that it would be very similar to 2020 is my expectation. I wish that I had the confidence that it would be more significant. So it would be this, mandate that we're talking about. That would be like, of course, Donald Trump's now decisively lost multiple times. We need to move on. But I listen to my friend David Axelrod, who's, knows Joe Biden well and does raise alarms about the age factor, about the vulnerabilities that come with that. I really want to echo Jennifer's point, by the way, about no labels. It is dangerous what they are doing. It might as well just be an in-kind contribution to the Trump reelect. There's no other way to put it. But I think it's Biden by a similar margin. But I never sleep on the fact that Donald Trump has surprised me more times than I can count. And it would be irresponsible to rule out the possibility that he could be elected president again.
Stuart?
Look, I haven't seen a poll where Biden is beating Trump.
Yeah.
So and if 44,000 people had changed their vote in exactly the right places, Trump would still be president. Yeah. So, I've done 5 of these presidentials. I've sat in those rooms. I think the willingness of Republicans now to use the power of the state to do everything they can to curate the vote, let's call it, should not be underestimated, and the impact that that can have. Um, I think well, it's impossible to say what's going to happen now. But I think there's every reason to believe it'll be a very tight race. I would predict that Biden is going to be behind until the Democratic convention. Once this race shapes up and Trump is the nominee. Look at that first post Labor Day poll. That'll be very predictive. I mean, I will say this. I think the Biden campaign is greatly undervalued in political circles for what they did. You know, it is extraordinarily difficult to beat an incumbent president. And when we had federal funding, it leveled the playing field, which people forget. But we did that in the Bush campaigns. And when we had federal funding, two incumbents lost, Bush and Carter. It's fair to ask, when is the last incumbent president who lost, who was not in the federal funding system? And before Trump, that was Herbert Hoover. So it is very, very difficult to beat an incumbent, which is favorable for Trump. But I mean, for Biden. But I think every reason to believe it'll be very close.
Jen?
I'm going to be the optimist in the group. I don't think there are many, if any, Americans who didn't vote for him, who suddenly are going to vote for him. And that's what needs to be happening. He has to have more votes, or at least a percentage of the vote, higher than he did last time. Obviously, turnout is always going to be an issue. But I would say three things. One, I have come to believe that most poll is crap. And what is crap about it is you're never going to have another president, I think, in my lifetime, who beyond the first few months has a positive approval rating. That's just how Americans are. If you're in power, they don't like you. Secondly, don't ask them how the economy is. They're always going to say it's negative, even when it's not, or regardless of what they do. So polling, I wouldn't bother with. Secondly, I think Joe Biden can lean in a bit to the age thing, a la Ronald Reagan, and not hold his youth.
Yeah.
And oh, by the way, if he's running against Trump, that's a complete wash, because he can run against, a slightly younger guy and say, listen, I'm slightly older, but much saner than the guy I'm running against. And there that goes. So it would be an absolute gift to him to run against Donald Trump. He's not running in a vacuum. He's running, as he likes to say, not against the almighty, but against the alternative. And the third is, people have underestimated Joe Biden his whole life. And he understands something fundamental about the American people that all of us miss again and again. He has an ability to connect when he walks into a Black church, and you can feel that emotion when he walks into a union hall, and you can feel that tide. He has something of an old school attachment to the American people that those of us who have become frustrated with them, angry with them, even condescending towards them have lost. He has not. And I think he has the ability once more to sort of show up the opposition. And I think I would say there's a 60% chance that he wins by the same margin as he did last time. I'll say there's a 30% chance that he wins by more, and there's a 10% chance he loses. But that 10% is so grave, has such deep consequences, that we all have to do whatever is in our power to prevent that from happening.
Let's wrap up with this. Quick responses, Alyssa, then Stuart, then Jen, to a question that's not about Donald Trump, but that is about our country. The United States, the year is 2040. What kind of country do we have? Alyssa?
I'm going to go with optimism here, and my better instinct says not to. But I have a lot more faith in the American people than I do in our elected officials. Of the 74 million people who voted for Donald Trump, I think many of those are good, kind, decent, non-bigoted, inclusive, loving people who frankly, they're working, they're busy, they're not following every conflict. They may not really be read into why Ukraine, for example, matters for America and for the free world. They maybe don't know the latest scandal with Donald Trump. There are people like many of my family members. But I do think that the people are the soul of this nation, and the voters have showed some sophistication and waking up to the threats of the direction that extremism was taking us. I think the midterms were an example of that. I think the fact that nearly across the board election deniers lost shows that even busy, hardworking people who don't really tune in that much to politics, other than every couple of years when it comes time to vote, said, I may even be Republican, but I'm not going to vote for an extremist. That gives me some confidence. But on the flip side, we always talk about our republic as an experiment. The great American experiment has to have people of good faith on both sides. It is part of why I, at this juncture, refuse to leave the GOP, because I want to see two vibrant parties that represent the values I think that this country holds, and to chase out the dark corner of the party that's kind of taken hold. So I'm going to say we're a functioning democracy in 2040. And I think that we'll have an emerged third political party that could be viable probably in statewide elections, but not federally.
Mm-hmm. Stu?
Well, 2040 will be a minority majority country. So it's going to be a very, 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 very different America. And I think the consequences of that, or what is driving, the reality of that is driving a lot of the people who are really behind this move to autocracy in the Republican Party. They understand this. Look, I'm in a hold our breath to 2032 mode, because I think if we can get to 2032 and be able to pass down a democracy, we'll be okay. Mm-hmm. I don't really think about the odds. I just know that all you have to do is fight. And the best fights you don't get in because you think you're going to win. You get in because you have to fight. Yeah. So, I never thought at this point in my life I'd be doing what I'm doing now. But I don't really see an alternative. So I think you just have to wake up every morning and try to crush these people, because it is evil.
Jen?
I am much more confident in the long term than in the short term, because Generation Z and millennials are much more educated, much more scientifically sophisticated, much more inclusive, and much less fundamentalist in their religion than the preceding generations. And if we cannot screw it up, as Stu said, if we can hand it off, whether it's 28 or 32, I think we'll be okay. And I think until then, it's a lot closer odds than any of us would like to acknowledge.
Jennifer Rubin, Stuart Stevens, Alyssa Farah-Griffin, thank you all so much. Terrific conversation. Great guests. We really appreciate your time. I'm Michael Tomasky, editor of The New Republic. Read The New Republic, please. Subscribe to The New Republic, please. We're practically paying you to take it at this point, so please look into that. Read TNR.com. And thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.